So let's get into creating some basic materials in our studio scene. So to start with, let's create a sphere, and we're going to make it 50 centimeters radius, and we'll just move it into the center of our scene. And in the top view, let's just get that in the middle there. Go back to our camera view, pressing C. And the first material we're going to make is a chrome. So the first thing we're going to do is name our material. So I'm going to double click on our material and I'm going to name it chrome. If we double click on our thumbnail, that will make it bigger. And you can also close up all of the maps here if you need more room. And one other thing we can do is turn on a background. So if we have reflections, I'll quickly show you that. We can now see something's reflecting it. If we didn't have this viewport on, we wouldn't be able to see it's reflecting. So let me just turn that back to how it was. For the chrome, we're going to have the diffuse as black, seeing as it will have no color. Something to remember is in reality, we never have fully black or fully white materials. It's just not realistic. So I'm just going to make that just off of black. And then in the reflection, I'm going to make that as white as I can. So just a couple off of, 255. And let's run an interactive render and let's see how that looks. So I'm going to open up our frame buffer and I'm going to hit interactive here. I'm just going to close that. And let's make sure we've got that applied to our object. So here we'll see Fresnel reflections, and what the Fresnel does is the amount of reflectance based on the viewing angle. So the basic rule is use Fresnel on everything except for metal. So with that in mind, let's turn Fresnel off and we can see that our chrome is reflecting nicely. Okay, so I'm going to stop that and I'm going to select our material and zoom out a little bit, and then holding shift, click and drag that across. And if your preview doesn't update, you can always update it here. It should update automatically. And another bug I've noticed in Macs is sometimes you won't be able to delete something. So if I select this material and hit delete, sometimes that won't delete, and a quick way to solve that is just to go into your viewport and click off of that material and maybe click it again. And then when you hit delete, you'll be able to delete it. I haven't managed to replicate it in this example, but if you do come across that, it's worth knowing. So this material, we're going to call it brushed chrome. And you guessed it, we're going to make a brushed chrome. And the only thing we need to change here is the glossiness. So we can see what this does. So let's pull it down to 0.2. And let's apply this and run the interactive render. And we can see what that does. So if I pull that up to 0.5, you can see it's not fully reflective. So let's leave this on something like 0.65 and we can see that's made quite a nice brushed chrome metal. Next, let's make a plastic. So I'm going to right click, material, Vray and Vray material. And I'm going to name this plastic. And you'll notice that the Fresnel is on by default. So all we have to do in here is change the plastic color. I'm going to turn on the background. I want some reflections, so let's turn this onto like a mid-grey. And let's apply this to our object. So we'll select it, assign to selection, and we'll run the interactive. And we can see that's beginning to look like plastic, but these reflections are really crisp, probably a bit too crisp. So let's bring this glossiness down to 0.7. And I think we've got quite a nice plastic material there. Okay, so let's take a look at something a little bit different now, and let's make some glass. So I'm going to create a new Vray material and rename it glass. Now there'll be no diffuse color. Let's just make that black. And because glass is transparent, we are going to use the refraction. So it works in the same way as reflection. So fully black will be no transparency, mid-gray will be semi-transparent, and white will be pretty much full transparency. So let's put on a background and we can see what's happening here. Let's turn on some reflection as well. So I'm pulling that nearly all the way to white. And let's apply that to our object and assign to selection and run the interactive. We can see we've got a nice glass material there, and we can quickly change this to frosted glass using the refraction glossiness. So if we just pull down the refractive glossiness, you'll see that that's now become more of a frosted glass. It's probably be better demonstrated if I draw something behind the object. So there's our clear glass and our frosted glass. Now we can also make the glass coloured, and we can do that by using this fog colour. So it's currently on white, and let's say we want it red. We can add just a touch, like 1 in the saturation. It's really exaggerated, so we can now move this color slider along, and it's going to create different colored glass. I mean, if you wanted to create rear headlight glass, for example, you could use a really strong red, but that's how we can add color to our glass as well. And just going back to that bug, you'll see that if I stop this render and I try and delete this glass material, I'm hitting delete and it won't delete. And I found that you have to just select in the viewport and off again, and then you'll be able to delete that material. So if that happens, it can be quite annoying. So that's how to fix it. Now let's take a look at some wood. So let's create a new material, Vray material. Let's rename it wood. So we can use textures in our materials, and textures are what we call images. And textures are basically images that we plug into the material. So you can use the wood texture that is in the resources for this class. And another great place you can find textures is textures.com. And they've got a massive selection of textures you can use. But for now, I'm going to use the wood texture I've supplied with the class. So I'm just going to drag and drop that in. That's a really quick way of getting a bitmap into our material editor. You could also right click, go to Maps, General, Bitmap, and then load it up from this dialog box. And then I'm going to just drag and drop onto here and plug this into the diffuse. And you'll see that we now have a texture in our diffuse slot rather than a color. And you can see that represented by this M here. Now let's apply that to our object. And I'm going to change our viewport to show shaded. That's by pressing F3. And if I hit show shaded material in viewport, we can now see this on our object. One thing to check is that you have real world mapping turned off here in the sphere and also in this bitmap. It could or might not be turned on and off, and this is to do with mapping, and I'm going to talk about that in another lesson. So let's run an interactive and see what we've got at the moment. So already using a texture looks pretty good. Some other things we can do is in reflection we can add a mid-grey, and we can see that that's looking really shiny, probably too much, so I'd bring down this glossiness to 0.8. And for me, that's still too shiny for this type of wood. It looks quite rough. So let's try 0.5. And that probably too much as well. 0.2 will probably do it. So another thing we can add to this texture is a bump map. And a bump map can add depth to your material using a texture without adding a lot of render time. So in the same way that our reflections and refractions are based off of black, white and grey, if we have a bump map and it has a dark area in it, so it's black, it will add depth, and if it's white, it will push it out. So a rough and ready way to do this, not exactly the correct way, but this is how I do it to get quick bump maps, would be to select our bitmap and drag a map out of it and select the general color correction and double click on that so we can go into the parameters. So anything we click in this canvas, we can go into its parameters. So this is our main material, so all of our Vray properties that I showed you earlier, and then this is the map properties, and this is our new color correction that we're going to use. And we're going to use this to turn our map to black and white, so we can turn on monochrome. And I'm just going to plug, in fact, let's have a quick look at it. So it's made it black and white, so these dark areas are going to add depth, and the lighter areas, they're going to get pulled out. So this isn't exactly a nice bump map, but it will do to demonstrate here. So I'm going to plug that into the bump. And if we zoom in, we can see that that's added some depth to our material. And back in our material, we can go to maps and turn up the bump. So if we turn it to 90, we'll see that the effect gets quite extreme. You can see it here. We probably want it a lot more subtle than that, so let's leave it on 30. So the bump map is a quick way of adding some more detail to your materials. Now let's create a fabric, so we'll create a new material. And I'm going to call this fabric. And again, you can go to textures.com and get your own material. I've got this jeans material. We're just going to drag and drop in. Just going to make sure real world is ticked off, and I'm going to plug it into our diffuse. And let's apply this to our object and show shading in viewport, and that's going to show our texture. So we can see the texture is quite large. So what we can do in the map itself is change the tiling. So if we change this to 2, this image will be tiled twice, which gives us a better scale. And let's add a bump map the same way we did with the wood. I'm just going to click and drag and add a color correction and change it to monochrome, and I'm going to plug that into the bump. And as I said earlier, you should probably use a tool like Photoshop to get more accurate bump maps, but this will suffice for now. In the fabric material, I'm going to go to maps and I'm going to turn the bump map up to 50 just to add a little bit more depth and texture to the fabric. And something that happens with cloth is that as it curves away from you, it gets lighter. So to stop the fabric looking flat, it's a good idea to add a fall off map. And we can do that by clicking and dragging out of our bitmap, going to maps, general, and fall off. And we'll plug that into map 1. Now, don't worry about how many maps there are. You'll soon begin to find your way around as you start using some of these. I probably use 20% of the maps in here. So don't worry too much about it. Don't get overwhelmed by it. Let's plug our fall off into the diffuse. And we can see that we've got our texture in the middle, and then as it falls off, it turns to white. So there's our texture, and it's turning into white on the fall off. And that's a bit much, so I'm going to plug in our texture to map 2, which is here, but I'm going to add a color correction. And plug it in, so now it will go back to as it was before, because these two are exactly the same at the moment. But in the color correction, I'm just going to go to advanced and change this to 2 to make it brighter. And now on the curve, this texture is going to be used, and on the inside, this darker texture will be used. So we can see it gets lighter on the curve. And we can increase this effect by going to the fall off mix curve and just right clicking and change this to Bezier corner, and we'll create an S curve in here. And that's looking pretty good for a jean material. And one last material I want to look at is colored metal. So let's create a final V-Ray material for now. And I'm going to call it gold. So there's 2 ways we can create colored materials. The first way is the same way as we created the chrome, and that's by turning our diffuse to black, turning off our Fresnel reflections, just going to turn on our background here, and changing the reflection to pretty much white. And then we can pull the glossiness down to something like 0.8, and there we have our metal. And if we wanted to add a color, we'd actually add it in the reflect. So if we add a goldish color, we can see that's how you can create gold using this method. And now, and there is a newer way to create colored metal, and it's using a property called metalness. So I've just shift and dragged across this material. I'm going to call this gold 2, and let's change this reflection back to white, and we'll turn the Fresnel back on, and then this time we're going to turn metalness all the way to 1, and we can see because our diffuse is black, this is now black. So let's change this to more of a gold color and hit OK, and we can see that's the other way we can make metal. So let's apply that to our object. You can also click here and drag onto objects to apply to an object, and you can see we've got quite a nice gold material. Hi guys, and thanks for watching. I hope you found that video useful. This video is actually part of a larger course, so if you think you'd find that useful, then check out the link in the description and feel free to like and subscribe.